Cool. I think we're ready to go. Hopefully you can all hear me. If somebody could gesticulate in some way to say that I'm coming through. Yeah, fantastic. Great. So yeah, welcome to this discussion on the physiology of the 400 meters. So we're just waiting for my laptop to buffer a minute. Sorry, my laptop was being slow here. Wait a minute. There we go. Yeah, so my name's Dan Nash. I'm a PhD researcher at Cardiff Met, part funded by Welsh Athletics and Welsh Triathlon. So I deliver physiology support for those two governing bodies. Myself, I'm not really a sprint specialist. I'm a longer, the better kind of guy, as you can see from my 400 meter PB there, which I thought you'd find amusing. We're not coming from here, are we now? But yeah, today we're going to talk about the 400 meters. Like, in terms of what the scientific community knows about the sprints, I think it's fair to say it's a bit less than what we do about the endurance. It's really quite a hard area to study. And so I think there's lots that we don't know, or science still doesn't have the answer to. So I very much want this to be like a discussion, and please shout out any questions that you have as we go through. You can put them in the chat, and Reese Williams is monitoring that. Perfect. So yeah, any questions if you have, shout out as we go along. This is always being recorded, so you can watch it afterwards and go through anything afterwards if you have any questions. But yeah, what are we going to go through today? So firstly, we're going to go through a bit of a performance model. So actually, what determines success over the 400 meters? What requirements you need to be good at an elite level in the 400 meters? And obviously, we're going to talk about that. Part of that is going to be your maximal speed. And we're going to talk about how you can develop that, what capacities you need to run really quickly, but also the endurance element of it. So actually, the 400 meters it's a sprint, but it's a long sprint, and actually the best over 100 aren't necessarily the best over 400. So what are the requirements from that, and how can we train that? Sorry, some few technical things in the studio here. And then also we're going to talk about, or I'd like to talk about, some of the aerobic requirements in terms of actually what is the aerobic influence of the 400 meters? What does that mean for recovery from training? And also how does it affect the training response? So hopefully that you've all followed me there. As I said, any questions as you go along, put them in the chat or just unmute yourself and shout out. Yeah, and we'll get started. So, performance model. One thing that's really obvious that stands out is actually your maximal speed. And by maximal speed, I'm not talking about 100 meters time. I'm not talking. We'll get rid of the blocks. We're not really interested in that. We're just actually what is the maximal velocity that you can hit. So we often test like a flying 30 meters. So from a rolling start, actually, what speeds can you hit for 30 meters? In terms of meters per second or kilometers an hour. And the research out there shows there's a really strong relationship between actually the time you can run for 30 meters, a flying 30 meters, and the 400 meter time. And we've got a nice graph here I've pulled out of a reasonably old paper, but actually quite a nice study where they've got athletes ranging from 45 seconds down to 52 seconds for 400 meters. And you can see you can pretty much draw a straight line through all of the data points saying that actually the speed that you can run 400 meters correlates really nicely with the speed the max speed you can achieve over 30 meters. So that's obviously gonna cap the ceiling of what we can run for 400 meters. If you can't run, if you can't achieve a speed over 30 meters, then there's no way you can sustain it over 400 meters. So obviously that is going to set the ceiling for our 400 meter performance. But then actually what then determines actually your maximal velocity, your max speed? So without going into too much detail, we're talking about actually how much force can you put into the track and at what rate can you put that force in. So we're talking about actually there's a strength component, but actually how we don't want to just be super strong. We need to apply that force really quickly and in the right direction. So we want short ground contact times, fast cadence, getting our legs back into the right position really quickly to have a really nice, to make a really nice technical model. And as I said, yeah, apply lots of force really quickly in the right direction is basically the name of the game. So that is a quick overview of max speed. But then we can talk about endurance. And I put endurance in quotation marks here because coming from being a bit best at the marathon, really, and what as a physiologist I would talk about as endurance isn't normally what I would correspond with a 400-meter event, where actually the velocities are still very, very high. But there is obviously still fatigue mechanisms that occur over the course of 400 meters and are slowing down. You can't sustain your 100-meter speed and your max velocity all the way to the 400 meters. So we have fatigue mechanisms happening within the muscle, things like acidity, using up of energy substrates like depleting ACP. Lots of other molecules, molecular changes are happening within the muscle that are causing fatigue and actually starting to inhibit the muscle function. And what you see is that there's actually a drop in the force production. So actually in each foot strike, there's less force can be applied, but also the frequency of the cadence drops as well. So you can't contract your muscles as quickly. So your muscles are contracting less forcefully, but also they're not going, you can't recruit them as quickly. And hopefully now we can talk through this graph here. So I've put 3 of the best athletes in the world: Fred Curley, Wade van Niekerk, Michael Norman, and all I've done is I've plotted their speeds, their average speeds over the 100 meters, the 200 meters, and the 400 meters. And obviously, all these guys, exceptional over 400 meters, but also exceptional over the 100. But still some variability there. And we can see that Fred Curley in the blue, fastest over 100 meters. Actually, by the time he gets to 200 meters, he's in the middle of the 3 athletes, and by the 400 meters, he's actually the slowest. So actually, you could argue that Fred Curley, either genetically or because of training, his endurance, his ability to sustain his top end speed isn't as good as, for example, world record holder Wade van Niekerk. So again, exceptional athlete, can still run a very good 100-meter time, but he's the slowest out of those 3. Still the slowest at 200 meters, but he has got the ability to sustain his force production, his cadence to a much greater extent than Michael Norman and Fred Curley. So although maximal speed is probably the most important determining factor of that top end, who finishes first, second, third, endurance and that endurance component is still going to be important. Now, to highlight that a bit more, these are 3 athletes who are actually very similar in terms of their 100-meter, 200-meter, 400-meter times in the grand scheme of things, although they're, one's a world record holder and the other 2 obviously aren't. But now if we plot on 2 more athletes, so we've got Joe Bryan and Alex Haydock Wilson. So Joe, obviously one of the best 400-meter runners, if not the best 400 meters in Wales at the moment. And I've also chosen Alex Haydock Wilson because he's got a nice he's got plenty of marks in his power of 10, basically over 100, 200, 400. And so we can compare them quite nicely to the other 3 athletes here. But the thing that jumps out at me, and hopefully you guys as well, is that actually their maximal speed just isn't as good as those world-class athletes, those world record holders in Van Niekerk. But actually, they're still holding a really high percentage of their speed and pretty similar to those top guys in the world. And actually, I could argue here that Joe is holding his speed better, or a higher percentage of his speed, than maybe Fred Curley is. Now that can hopefully that can help inform you then in training, actually saying, what does this athlete particularly need to focus on? Do we need to increase their maximal velocity, their max speed, or some element of their conditioning, their ability to hold a high percentage of that speed? So obviously both are important, But I think actually you're never going to be a world-class 400-meter runner, or I'm certainly never going to be a world-class 400-meter runner, because my 100-meter time is nowhere near good enough, however good my endurance got. So actually that's the play you need, that's part of the coaching balance that you guys need to work with, is how much speed and how much endurance. I would argue, we can talk a bit more about how we develop those capacities later in the next slides coming up. So developing maximal speeds, like, you guys are the experts here. This is your bread and butter. So I don't want to tell you how you guys to coach, but just some basic inputs from my perspective as a physiologist and scientist. Key thing is actually, if we want to train to improve our max speeds, we need to run our max speeds. There's no way we're going to get faster without actually doing some very fast running. But actually, what's important to remember here, I think, is we're after speed and not effort. So actually, if we want to get good at running as fast as we can, improve that maximal velocity, then we need to enable the athlete to run at those speeds. And I think part of that is a scheduling thing, making sure they're coming in well rested. Like, we're definitely not going weight room to track. If anything, it's the other way around, track and then weight room. So make sure they're neurally fresh, they haven't got muscle soreness, etc. Keeping intervals really short, so we can't sustain our peak speed for very long. Even at the end of 100 meters, athletes are slowing down. We all know this. So, circa 20 to 50 meter efforts, but with very, very long recoveries, to make sure that actually we're not seeing big drop-offs in speed and the time over the series of the reps. I mean, environment helps as well. If you're lucky enough to have NIAC, then that's fantastic in the winter. You've obviously got the straight in Swansea as well. It becomes more difficult in the winter if you haven't got those indoor environments. But there are things that you can do. And then going back to actually what makes up, what components allow you to run at a fast speed and have a high maximal speed. Strength, power, elasticity, and the technical model, the four key things I've listed there. So we need enough strength, because actually it's not the strongest person who wins. You need to be able to apply that strength really quickly. So that comes more into the power side of things. Elasticity, so if we're going to have stiff on the ground and store lots of that energy in our tendons and release it, then that's going to allow us to run faster and produce more force. And then again, the technical model, so that we're applying those forces in the right direction and getting the most speed out of the power we're producing. Strike and how you train those is, you guys are going to be really familiar with that. But obviously, resistance training is going to improve strength. Power is more, and elasticity and more of those plyometrics. Then the technical model, that leaves the realms of physiology and goes more into coaching. But can be quite difficult to train. Now, what I've got here is some data we've collected from our national development athletes over just recently, back in November, and we've got counter movement jump, so just a one-off jump, and measuring their peak power from that. So basically, how high did they jump relative to their body weight? And we've plotted that against maximal speeds, for speed from a flying 30 meters. And you can see there's a really strong relationship. So actually, if we can get someone who can produce more force in a single jump, which is effectively a measure of power, then they're going to run faster. So as part of our training to improve our max speeds, some sort of strength and plyometric training is going to be really important. Elasticity. So elasticity, we've used a hop test here, and we've calculated reactive strength index, or RSIs, and that's basically just the difference between the time that you've spent in the air divided by the time you spent on the ground. So an athlete who spent a lot of time in the air and not too much time on the ground, who's been able to produce a lot of force and react really quickly to the ground, is going to have a higher RSI, and that should mean that you've got more elasticity, better tendon properties. Now, there's not a strong relationship here between the RSIs and the max speeds, but there's still a sort of, it looks like there's still a linear relationship, and we'd expect that if somebody has got these more elastic properties from doing plyometric work, then they're going to be able to run faster. So that's the speed side of things. Now, I think endurance here is where it gets maybe a bit messy. And I think partly, as I said earlier, it's really hard to measure these things in an athlete's measures of anaerobic energy capacities is really hard to quantify. And so I think the literature and the research is lacking a bit in this area. But I think instead of looking at actually, is this aerobic, is this anaerobic, I think we can lump it all into this key term of endurance, basically. And actually all of the energy systems that we have, so the ATP creatine phosphate system, which is that one which is really short, lasts for about 6 to 10 seconds, but then is used up. We've got the glycolytic anaerobic capacity system, this red one here, which again takes a bit longer to get going but produces a lot of energy, but comes with lots of waste products as well. And then the aerobic system, which takes even longer to get going, but is much more sustainable and doesn't lead to the fatigue that comes with that anaerobic capacity. All of these things can help endurance over 400 meters to a lesser or greater extent. Now, how much each one is worth, it's hard to know. It's hard to quantify. But actually, if we can increase, for example, our ATP creatine phosphate system by taking creatine, then that is going to give you more energy to use and burn and release in the 400 meters, and it's going to translate into better endurance, if you want to call it that. The same like with the anaerobic capacity, that can be thought of as a battery, which we either use really fast or really slow. If we can increase our anaerobic capacity, then that's also going to translate into more energy available for the 400 meters and better endurance. And then aerobic capacity as well. If we've got a bigger aerobic capacity, a bigger VO2 max, and we can get more of our energy from that pathway as well, then that in theory could translate into a better endurance as well, and the ability to hold a top end speed for longer. Now, I think that aerobic contribution to the 400 meters is a bit controversial, and I've gone through a few papers, most of them quite old. It doesn't seem to be looked at too much recently, but there's a bit of a range in actually how much of our energy in a 400 meters is coming from aerobic capacity. Like from the papers I read, they're referencing about 10 to 20%, so it's not insignificant. But actually, how much of that how much does that improve with training is a question we haven't got to ask. It's probably going to it probably depends a bit upon how fast you're running. The slower you run, the more aerobic the event is going to be. So if you're a female 400 meter runner, because you're taking longer, you've got more time to get that aerobic capacity up to speed. And so because it's more of a longer event, it's going to be more of an endurance event, very marginally. And so it's going to probably have a bit more of an aerobic requirement compared to the men in the 400 meters. So that is going to dictate it a little bit. But I think the message is that actually, regardless of how endurance manifests itself, you can improve your ability to sustain that top end speed with training. But what does that training look like? So I think the obvious one is it's going to have to be submaximal speeds. But we're not going to be improving our endurance probably by doing flying 30 meter sprints. But how submaximal and actually how slow do you want to go as a 400 meter runner? And I think that becomes the question here. So what speed you select or what intensity you select is going to determine the energy system that you stress most. So actually we've got, if we're looking at race paces here, 200 meters to 800 meter race pace, then that's going to emphasize more the anaerobic capacity, the glycolysis system. It's about that red curve on the graph in the top right. Whereas if we go a little bit slower, so 800 meters to 2K race pace, it's going to be more of that aerobic capacity type stuff. So VO2 max is probably going to be the thing that's stressed more. And then the last one I've got there, which is sort of talking pace intensity, so quite really low intensity, which is going to lead to more aerobic conditioning at a submaximal level, which I'll go into a bit more detail later. But I think the important thing is to emphasize is that it's not a on or off. You're not doing anaerobic capacity glycolysis, or you're doing VO2 max. It's a spectrum, and you can see that in the graph in the top right, and we've got a big overlap between the three energy systems, and we're not just switching one on and then another one off. We're always using all of the systems simultaneously. But I think in terms of what is going to lead to specific adaptations or specific endurance adaptations for a 400-meter runner, it's going to be some mixture of that anaerobic capacity glycolysis work from working at 200-meter to 800-meter race pace, and probably some of that aerobic capacity, which is more going to come from work at 800 to 2-kilometer race pace. And they're probably the things that are going to help you shift the curve to improve your endurance. Now, we're always going to talk a bit later about some of the really low intensity training, but I would argue that they can make you can get certainly adaptations from that sort of training, and it may be useful for the 400-meter athlete to do some of that training, but it's probably more indirect rather than direct effects that are going to impact on performance. Hopefully I'll clarify a bit of that in the coming slides. So firstly, we'll talk about these specific adaptations here. So the sort of glycolysis and VO2 max part of the equation. So these are the things that are hopefully going to pull the curve upwards so that we see a less of a drop off in your maximal speed compared to your 100-meter, 200-meter velocities. So anaerobic capacity, anaerobic tolerance. The goals of that sort of training are to produce high lactate levels, right, effectively, in terms of actually want to really stimulate anaerobic capacity, our glycolysis pathway. We don't need to measure lactate. Athletes can feel lactate pretty nice. Well, they can tell you if they're feeling those sort of symptoms of nausea, muscle fatigue, etc. But again, as a general rule, we're looking at sort of the longer side of intervals, 200 to 400-meter intervals, long recoveries, because actually we want to be able to produce high lactate, high forces repeatedly. So there's no point doing 300-meter intervals with a minute recovery, because the first one might produce a high amount of lactate and produce high forces and velocities, but obviously the fatigue from that is going to mean the pace quickly drops off. So we really want to trigger those fast twitch fibers with high levels of lactate, high acidity, to get those sort of anaerobic capacity and anaerobic tolerance adaptations. Now, the other side of is the aerobic, like sort of VO2 max kind of adaptations. And here the goal of the training shouldn't be to necessarily have high lactates. It should be to have a high heart rate, because instead of the anaerobic capacity is very much based upon stuff happening within the muscle and those sort of fatigue elements, whereas the VO2 max is much more part of a cardiovascular demand. And so actually we're here now after a good sign that we've had a good aerobic stimulus is we're getting a good amount of time at high heart rates. And you can use heart rate to track that, or just go off of efforts and RPEs and that sort of thing. But I think there's sort of two ways to tackle this and tackle a VO2 max kind of intensity session. You can either do longer intervals with moderate recoveries. So I've given the example here of 6 times 90 seconds at 2-kilometer pace with 90 seconds recovery. Now these are just rough guides, but basically with a longer interval, we want time for heart rate to get all the way up to near max and be at max for a few seconds. And with a 400-meter type of athlete, you're going to get your heart rate up quite quickly, and it's not going to come down really slowly in the recoveries either. The other option you've got is to do very short intervals, but with very short recoveries. So 8, for example, I've given here is 8 by 100 meters at 800-meter race pace, but with just 20 seconds recovery. And that's going to mean that heart rate is barely going to come down at all in recoveries. And actually, if you looked at the heart rate, it would be up at the first 100 meters, and then it wouldn't come down at all really until after the final 800 meters. And for your 400 meter athletes, that might be a nicer way of doing it in some respects. Probably not nice with the athletes because it's not the kind of training they like, but you can run at a faster speed. You don't need it without whilst stimulating the same cardiovascular adaptations. So that actually you don't have to run at 2 kilometer race pace with the long intervals, which would be very, very slow, feel very, very slow, and look at not have the same technical model anywhere near that of running at 400 meter pace. Whereas actually, if you can run 8 by 100 meters at 800 meter pace, that's going to feel technically more comfortable for probably a 400 meter runner. So they're the two kinds of two methods I would say that you're going to increase your endurance in a 400 meter athlete. Then talking about sort of this low intensity stuff, and I've described this as talking pace training. So actually, for the 400 meter athletes, it would feel really, really easy, like 1, 2 out of 10, pushing your legs around on a bike, just above walking pace for a lot of sprinters. Now, what role could this play in the 400 meters, which is far removed from this intensity? Well, there are lots of adaptations that we can get from this low, steady effort training, this talking pace training. Things such as improving the function and number of our mitochondria within our muscles, capillarization, so that actually more blood vessels are surrounding our muscle fibers, and so there's a better perfusion of the muscles with oxygen, and which are also better at taking away waste products. Our slow twitch muscle fibers become better trained, and actually we often see quite good improvements in inflammatory status. So actually we see reduction in inflammation, all of which could translate into benefits for 400 meter runner. So firstly, this sort of training can really help just for improvements in just health and function. So actually things such as inflammation, insulin resistance, and actually I think that should be like the basis of any athlete, is before they think about doing any training, they need to be healthy and tolerating training, starting from a place of health. These adaptations could also be really important for recovery between rounds of a meet, or actually just from general training. So from doing your really high intensity anaerobic capacity types work that you're doing at 400 meter race pace, if you can improve some of these things, such as having better functioning mitochondria, capillarization, a reduced inflammatory status, then you're probably going to recover from these sessions more quickly, and that's going to allow you to actually increase the amount of training that you're doing. So actually you might be able to do, instead of doing 6 by 300 meters, for example, at close to 400 meter race pace, you might be able to tolerate actually 10 for the same amount of stress, because you're in a healthier place, you're more conditioned, you've got a better aerobic system to back up your training. And that's going to lead to then actually better adaptations from the training. Actually, you're going to, as well as tolerating the training better, you might actually respond better to that training, so that for a given level of training, you're going to get a bigger adaptation, a bigger increase in fitness. And so although indirectly, I think having some forms of actually really low intensity aerobic conditioning within your training program might help to tolerate your training and indirectly improve your 400 meter race performance. Now, how does that practically fit into your training program? I think this is something where we've definitely gone past the point of where we've got evidence to say what is right, and we can just think about practically how would it work for you guys as coaches and your athletes. And I think any input from you guys now or at the end of this presentation would be really interesting to hear your thoughts. But in my eyes, taking actually what mode of exercise we want to do this in. Do we want it to be running? where actually the technical model would be very, very poor if you sent off a 400-meter athlete, a sprinter, to go and jog around the track. We've all seen sprinters jog and it doesn't look pretty. Maybe we should consider things such as an exercise bike, where it's actually much more easy to control the intensity, and we're not going to interfere with a technical model. You're not going to get muscle damage from cycling. So actually, that might be a nice tool, using some of that to get in some low intensity training within your training programs, without interfering too much with actually the stuff that is really key, which is about maximal speed development and later about 400-meter specific work. What duration? You're not going to be training for the marathon. You're not even training for the 800 meters. So actually, we don't need to be doing long duration stuff. Maybe like 30 minutes would be a good goal. I think you can start to see adaptations from 30 minutes of training, but actually, that doesn't necessarily need to be all in one go. It could be incorporating it into a warm up and cool down. So maybe do 20 minutes before, easy on a bike, before you do some more some run specific training, and then maybe you do a bit of a cool down on the end before going to the gym. And I think I think it's more about the total work you do over the week rather than actually trying to say, okay, today we're going to do an hour on the bike. I don't think we need to be going to that extreme, but I think it's more just about building healthy exercise habits around your training. And there's good evidence to suggest that actually even endurance athletes, if they spend too much time sitting down around their training, then they're not getting as big an adaptation and a response from the training. So actually sitting time can be, obviously we don't want to be on our feet all day, that's going to interfere with training, but actually being active and healthy and having a healthy lifestyle is going to set you up really nicely to take on and absorb all that specific training that you're doing. Frequency, again, we don't need to be doing it every single day, but I think targeting 3 or 4 times a week, trying to do something that's low intensity aerobic, could be something that's achievable and fits into a schedule, but is going to give you adaptations. And then again, scheduling, so we want to make sure that the priority is always going to be the run specific stuff. So actually, this stuff shouldn't take too much out of you if you can control the intensity, but making sure that it's not going to interfere with your key sessions in the week. And generally, it shouldn't do, because it's not a stressful activity. It's not going to leave you highly fatigued, but you need to think about where that might fit in relation to your strength training, your speed training, your anaerobic capacity type work. And then it becomes fitting it all together, periodization. How do you schedule your training over the course of a winter, of a whole season? How do you fit it in within a week? So we've talked a bit about the week stuff, but actually over the course of a season, how should you schedule your training? Now, firstly, I think there's little evidence to say that there's a particular periodization strategy that is best. That doesn't mean there isn't one, though. I'd say that actually these things are really hard to study. And I think what we need to do, because that evidence base, that research isn't there, is just think about logically, how should we approach this? And that's what I've done here. Feel free to say that I'm wrong. I don't mind being told that. But from what I've read, my understanding, what I know about sprinting, this would be my logical steps of how I would structure my training over the course of a year. So firstly, you want to establish an athlete's baseline. Where are they currently at in terms of their capacities? So bring it back to their endurance and their 30-meter speeds, their maximal speeds. Where do they sit? And actually break that down even more in terms of the maximal speed, because that's really important. Where do they sit in terms of their strength, their power, their elasticity, and just their max speed in general? And that's sort of the thing we've done with our NDP camp just recently. We've looked at their elasticity using the hop tests. We've looked at their power using the counter movement jump, and we've assessed their current maximal speeds. So that would be the first thing I would do, probably a bit earlier in the year, once you've come back off your break. I would then look at actually raising that ceiling. So we've said that maximal speed is the ceiling for your 400 meter ability. You can't run fast on your 30 meter speeds, and actually, if you want to be in the game, you need to be really quick over 100. So for me, that's where I would start, because actually you can't endure. You can improve your endurance as much as you like, but actually, if you're already holding a really high percentage of your maximal speed over 400 meters, then there's nowhere else for you to go. You can't get faster over 400 meters than you are over 100 meters. So for me, working on that maximal speed should be a key priority right from the start of the winter. And then once you've got that like that max speed in a nice place, and you've worked on the things that are going to improve that speed, just strength training, plyometrics, power training, then you can move on to the specific stuff that's going to help you doing stuff at 400 meter race pace. Now, I've put together a bit of a graphic here to help go through this again. So I've divided it up into speed development and endurance development. So within that speed development part, of the early part of the off season, let's say, or within the off season, we're looking at that strength training, at plyometrics, and trying to develop that maximal sprint speeds. And on the endurance side, I'd be starting off with actually prioritizing some of that low intensity training, where actually you've got more time. You're not trying to recover from these really high intensity anaerobic capacity type sessions. And that's going to help you absorb the training that comes later on. So starting off with some of that really, really easy stuff at torque intensity, before moving into more of that VO2 max and anaerobic, that VO2 max kind of training, which is higher intensity, but still quite aerobic. And that builds your extremes then. So you've got your really nice maximal speed, you've got the aerobic background to help you absorb the training, and then you can top it off with the race specific stuff. So doing stuff at race velocities and really help you improve your endurance, resulting in your peak there. So that is basically all I've gone through today. And I hope that's been interesting. If you have any questions or want to talk about anything, go through any of the slides again. Put it in the chat, unmute yourself, fire them away. If you haven't got any questions, that's fine. If you think of any later, Reese can pass you my email, and we can go from there.
Guys, I know some of you have sent questions through. Now's your time to kind of ask. I know Ian, you sent a question to me. I think Dan's covered that. Anyone who's emailed stuff in, Dan has covered questions. But yeah, now, as Dan said, now's your chance. Hopefully that's all made sense. But is there anything specific you want addressed? I hate it when you all go quiet.
Reese, just one thing. It's Wendy. I've got internet problems.
We had one question in from already sent in from Matt Elias, which was looking at actually talking about the percentage of the aerobic condition side, which is supporting the 400 meter race pace. And I said it was about 10 to 20% ballpark, but I think there's got to take some of that with a pinch of salt. I don't think we can clearly say, but I think that's the sort of range that we're probably shooting for. But I think the question is then, do we need to train that capacity? How much do we need to train that capacity? And I think that's for you guys as coaches to figure that out really, and actually see with your athletes what balance do they need in terms of more about aerobic side of training and more of that anaerobic capacity for specific 400 meter pace intensities. It's going to tend to depend a little bit about pardon me, it's going to depend a bit upon the athlete. So women probably going to need a bit more aerobic conditioning, I would say, than men, because their events are a bit longer. Also the type of athlete as well. Like if an athlete is a 400, 800 athlete, and you think actually that maybe they're not competing at 800 meters yet, but that might be their strength in the future, then maybe they need a bit more of an aerobic stimulus. Whereas maybe if you're more of a 1-2 specialist who's stepping up to the 4, then maybe they don't need quite so much of it. But I think it's going to be very much a carefully monitoring your athletes and seeing how they respond to the training. I think that covered that one.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course you can.
How does this apply to junior athletes, particularly very young junior athletes who won't be running 400s, but even 100 is like a 400 for them or a 150? How does that apply to them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, that's the key age where you really want to develop that max speed. And it's very hard to see what an athlete is going to do in the future. You might find that actually they're 800-meter athletes in the future, but if you can give them those tools that they need, certainly in terms of their technical model and actually improving that max velocity, then that's going to set them up really nicely for what event they're going to do in the future. I think that's the takeaway, is eventually you can get that really fast, that max speed in a good place from a early age. That's going to give you a better ceiling to improve your 400-meter time in the future, I'd say.
I mean, some under 13 junior athletes are running sub 220s or 800 meters, and yet they don't run 400 meters in competition. But they're quite capable of almost running around a minute for 400 meters. They probably will do 400 meters, so they're under 17 age group. They tend to run 300s, under 15 300s.
Yeah.
So where is that sort of? I mean, I would coach a junior club as well, and we are coaching juniors for 800 meters. In my own experience, it's a similar sort of training that I've done when I was running 400 meters or 800 meters. I'm trying to fathom where that fits in with junior athletes.
Yeah, and I think it's. I would say that if you've got a junior athlete who's already competing at quite under 13, as I said, running a 220 for 800, then that suggests to me that they've got quite naturally good aerobic qualities and are probably going to be 800 or 1500 meter athletes in the future. But even with those kind of athletes, you still need to be able to run very fast to be competitive at a high level. And so developing those speed qualities are still really important. And personally, I wish I had developed a bit more of that myself when I was younger. But I think it is trying to be at that under 13 level. I think it is trying to provide, if you can teach them to run really fast and give them a good technical model, but still improve that aerobic side of things as well. But they can go in whichever direction once they come out of puberty, which seems to suit them best.
Dan, we've had a question just from the chat from Sam Morgan. Could you clarify appropriate rest for different distances and sets?
Yeah, so I think if you're looking at max speed, then as long as the athlete needs to maintain the quality of their interval over time. So if they're doing 30, flying 30s, and you're doing 6 of them with 10 minutes recovery in between, and they're maintaining there's not too much of a drop off in pace, then that's fantastic. That should determine recovery. As long as you're not seeing a big drop off in velocities, then that's ideal. The anaerobic capacity stuff, again, it depends how much time you've got. Like if you've got plenty of time, give them plenty of recovery, because you want to be able to keep producing those forces and have high lactate values. Now, it doesn't matter so much if they fatigue a little bit, but what you don't want it to do is become a destructive session where actually they're ruined days afterwards because you worked them so hard. So you want to monitor it. Maybe you could observe yourself and see what percentage in drop off in time, sort of speed, means that you get a good session, but you don't leave them in a heap and tired for the next training session. Now, with the aerobic size, I think it does become a bit more important with recoveries, because you don't want them to be too long, because that's going to encourage them to run too fast, and it's going to become more of an anaerobic capacity type session. So if you can keep them reasonably short, then it's going to make that should be a session more aerobic and less anaerobic capacity kind of things. And that's a nice way of modulating the intensity of the session without even worrying about heart rate, lactate, RP. If you're good at prescribing your recoveries and the duration of your intervals, then that that means the athletes haven't got too much choice if they pace it well to do the session you want them to deliver. I hope that made sense and helped.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much.
Hope that's answered your questions, Sam. Does anyone else have any questions before? I know Dan's looking forward to going home and having his meal. Has anyone else got any questions?
Yeah, I got one, actually. Sorry, I said no, but yeah, I got one. So how do you judge a race over a 4 to get that first 200 right? Because if you go too quick, you're going to blow up. If you go too slow, it's quite hard to pick it up. How do you judge
I think
to get that?
I think a lot of that is athlete experience. I expect actually a lot of it. I think some of it will come down to the type of athlete they are. Like if you are, in the examples I gave earlier, a Fred Curley who hasn't probably got the endurance, then actually maybe he needs to get out as hard as he can because he's not got the ability to sustain a high percentage of it. Whereas if you've someone who's got more endurance or actually is as strong at the back end of the race, then they can afford to play that to their strengths a bit and finish really nicely.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it is also just experience and practice and how race prep. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Can you hear me?
Question? Yeah. No. Okay.
Guys, unless you've got anything burning, Adrian Thomas, I can see you staring at the screen.
Hi, Ed.
Very well. Do you have any questions?
I was just going to ask the question.
I think you're on.
What value is lactate testing? And what are you doing it for?
What's the value of lactate testing? Am I correct? Is that what you asked? And what do you take it for?
I think, to be honest, lactate can add a bit of value and help you describe the training you're doing, and maybe it can help you be a bit more precise in terms of like quantifying, is the session more of an aerobic session or is it more of one of those low intensity sessions I talked about, like the talk intensity sessions? Is it more of an anaerobic capacity? But actually, I don't think it's got a massive amount of value in the sprint space because most of the times lactate levels are just going to be really high. It can tell you maybe it can tell you a bit about the kind of athlete you are and how much, if you can produce lots of lactate, then maybe you've got a good anaerobic capacity. But all of the athletes who are running the 400 meters are going to be able to produce lots of lactate. And I don't know if we can say that those who produce the most lactate are going to be the best at the 400 meters. I don't think that's. I think there's too many other things going on to say that that's the case, really. So I think I don't think it adds massive value personally. I think what adds maybe more value is going back to those that graph I showed you earlier with Fred Curley and Wade Van Niekerk, plotting that yourself and looking at where your athlete sits compared to other athletes. Like you can very easily go onto Power of 10, find your competitors, find your athletes and see where they sit and actually what do you need to work on more, your speed, your endurance. I think things like doing the hop testing, the jump testing, measuring the final 30 meters on a regular basis will give you more information than using lactate personally. I hope that's helped, Adrian.
I think Adrian's on mute. You're just on mute, Adrian.
Is there any benefit of it, seeing the progress in terms of buffering?
Can't hear you, sorry, Adrian. But if anyone has got any other questions, feel free to just send them through, and obviously we can ask Dan, or if Dan's happy to share his email, we can ask him direct. Yeah. But obviously, guys, we're very grateful to have Dan with us here tonight. So thanks, Dan, and I hope that's covered most of your questions. Yeah, let's make this an annual thing and go from there. But thanks everyone for attending. We'll leave you escape. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Thanks.
No worries. Thanks.
Dan, can we actually have copies of that PowerPoint?
Yeah, of course you can. Yeah. You've recorded it, haven't you, Reese? But I can send out the recording.
We're gone, is it?